Hey everyone, this is chapter 1 of part 1 of the evolution of dialectical materialism, a philosophical and sociological analysis by Z.A. Jordan. I first came across Z.A. Jordan because he was, I read an article, which I think is an excerpt from this book, on the origins of dialectical materialism. This actually might be a rereading of that same recording, but I'm not exactly sure. But the book that this part is from is titled "The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism." The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism. Part 1 is titled "The Philosophical Sources of Dialectical Materialism," and Chapter 1, which is what this recording is titled "The Origins of Dialectical Materialism." The first section is titled "The Significance of Anti-During" by Engels. 2. The Prevailing View on the Intellectual Partnership of Marx and Engels. 3. Engels' Tradition in the Interpretation of Marx. And 4. The Naturalism of Marx and the Dialectical Materialism of Engels. So let's see. Let's get to... Here we are. The Origins of Dialectical Materialism. In the history of Marxian thought, the publication of Anti-During, Herrn Eugen Dörling's Umwälzung der Wissenschaft, turned out to be an epoch-making event. Originally planned as a polemical tract with a narrowly defined objective of no more than transitory importance, Anti-During gained the distinction of being the canonical statement of the doctrine which came to be known as dialectical materialism and acquired great renown all over the world. This book doesn't have footnotes, which is annoying, so there's like a citation here, but I can't easily access it. Actually, I can. What am I talking about? Let me duplicate this. $397, $417. Alright, so yeah. Actually, I have access because I can make an extra page of this PDF. Footnote. Engels claimed, quote, "I have him on the hip now," end quote. When at the planning stage he outlined the content of Anti-During and disclosed the tactics which he intended to follow in rewarding During, quote, "according to his just deserts," end quote. See Engels' letter to Marx of the 28th of May, 1876. End footnote. Engels is the founder of dialectical materialism, but he never used its now familiar name, calling it simply, quote, "modern materialism," end quote. While he saw its modernity in being, dialectical, that is, in the application of dialectics to the phenomena of nature, he left it to Plekhanov and Lenin to coin the new term, quote, "dialectical materialism," end quote. Yeah, I believe, at least to my limited knowledge, that dialectical materialism is a coinage of Plekhanov, or what I've been told is pronounced as Plekhanov. I'm not sure. Footnote. Plekhanov, zu Hegels 60. Todestag, ZAHD, originally published in Neue Zeit in 1891, and forward to the Russian translation of Engels' Ludwig Feuerbach, published in 1892. For the first time, Lenin used the expression, quote, "dialectical materialism" in What the, quote, "Friends of the People," end quote, are, published in 1894. End footnote. Although the term, quote, "dialectical materialism" is of later origin, there is no doubt that the oldest and most authoritative exposition of the doctrine itself is to be found in Anti-During. Dialectics of Nature, published posthumously only in 1925, is another important source of our knowledge about dialectical materialism, but while Anti-During gives a text fully approved and twice revised by Engels himself, Dialectics of Nature is only a collection of fragments, notes, and other materials for private use accumulated by Engels in the years 1873 to 1883 in preparation for a book which he never managed to complete. Footnote. As Engels himself informed us, since Marx's death, his time was required for more urgent duties, that is, the publication and republication of the works and manuscripts left by Marx, above all of the remaining volumes of Capital, and Engels was thus compelled to lay aside his own studies, although he hoped that he would return to them one day. The opportunity never materialized. End footnote. Therefore, it is anti-Düring rather than Dialectics of Nature that should be regarded as Engels' fully considered formulation of dialectical materialism. The commonly accepted view that Engels wrote anti-Düring in close collaboration with Marx has considerably enhanced its authority and reputation. Section 1. The significance of anti-Düring. In the spring of 1876, in response to the pressing demands of his political friends in Germany, Engels finally decided to settle accounts with Eugen Düring, who lived from 1833 to 1921. Jesus Christ. Footnote. In the special introduction to the English edition of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Engels explained the political reasons why it, quote, became necessary to take up the gauntlet thrown down to us, bracket, SC, by Düring, end bracket, and to fight out the struggle whether we liked it or not, end quote. End footnote. Engels finally decided to settle accounts with Eugen Düring, who lived from 1833 to 1921, Marx's detractor and short-lived rival, for the intellectual leadership within the German Social Democratic Party. While feeling duty-bound to face Düring's challenge, Engels was also disgruntled and in private complained to Marx of having to, quote, go after the scalp of the boring Eugen Düring, end quote. In the preface to the first edition of Anti-Düring, Engels emphasized that his book was by no means the fruit of any, quote, inner urge. He undertook the task of refuting Düring's, quote, new socialist theory, end quote, only because it was imperative to prevent sectarian quarrels and splits from developing within the party. The popularity of Düring was symptomatic of the revival of utopian socialism, which replaced the, quote, materialistic basis, end quote, of socialism, quote, by modern mythology with its goddesses of justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity, end quote. Footnote, Marx's letter to F.A. Zorga on the 19th of October, 1877. Since Marx and he had tried to emancipate the German workers from sentimentality and socialistic daydreams for decades, they could not allow some, quote, muddleheads, end quote, to influence the leaders of German socialism with their, quote, silly, stale, and reactionary, end quote, utopianism. However, he undertook the polemical task reluctantly, for Düring was not a serious opponent, and on his account, he was forced to neglect more important work. Although Engels thought that his exposure of Herr Düring's, quote, banalities and, quote, sublime nonsense, end quote, necessary as it appeared at that time, would soon become useless and fall into oblivion, 2 more editions of Anti-Düring were published before Engels died in 1895, and many more after that date. Footnote. Originally, Anti-Düring appeared in Vorwärts, the central organ of the United German Social Democratic Party. The first installment was published in January 1877 and the last in July 1878, 1.5 years later. As a separate book for the first edition of Anti-Düring appeared in 1878, the second in 1885, and the third in 1894. End footnote. Engels clearly had no inkling that his polemical examination of Düring's views would make history. The opponents of Engels in his dispute with Düring were no more perspicacious. When Anti-Düring first began appearing in Vorwärts by installments, some of its readers described it as, quote, completely without interest, end quote, and the annual Congress of the German Social Democratic Party, held in Gotha in May 1877, nearly decided to suppress it altogether. Anti-Düring was saved from being withdrawn from further publication by the transfer from the main columns to a theoretical supplement of Vorwärts. Footnote. Franz Mehring, Karl Marx, page 512. The scandal caused by Anti-Düring within the German Social Democratic Party was not restricted to Düring supporters. Many people were shocked by the violence of Engels' language and the content of his attack upon the blind private docent at Berlin University, who publicly defended socialism and was persecuted by the authorities for his heinous crime. It was widely believed at that time that Düring suffered persecution only because of his political convictions, and Engels himself rose to his defense in the preface to the second edition of Anti-Düring. According to K. Furlander, K. Forländer, Karl Marx, pages 251 to 2. This was not, however, the case. The ostensible reason for why the university senate deprived Düring of veniam legendi was because of his offensive attacks on Helmholtz and other Berlin scientists. Apparently there was no other path for the senate to take, since at that time Düring's alleged conceit rose to the height of a megalomaniac delusion. Whatever the true reasons responsible for Düring's loss of his private Dozentur at Berlin University were, his scholastic reputation was considerable. No lesser man than Ernst Mach spoke highly of Düring in Science of Mechanics, preface to the first German edition, and Engels' malice was both out of place and unjustifiable. When it came to defending Marx against his opponents, the kind, gentle, and modest Engels was quite capable of outdoing his friend in sarcasm, irony, invective, and ridicule. End footnote. From its first publication, Anti-Düring gained the reputation of being, next to the Communist Manifesto, the most successful work that came, as it has been believed, from the pen of Marx and Engels. Moreover, it is widely accepted that no book except Capital has done as much as Anti-Düring for the dissemination of Marxian thought. Antonio Labriola called it, quote, the most accomplished, and, quote, the unexcelled book in the literature of socialism, end quote. According to Lenin, Anti-Düring, quote, is a wonderfully rich and instructive book, end quote. Footnote. Antonio Labriola, Socialism and Philosophy, and another footnote, Lenin, Friedrich Engels. I guess it's from Lenin's collected work. It's just a piece titled Friedrich Engels. For Plekhanov, end footnote. For Plekhanov, the first part of Anti-Düring was the main and most authoritative source from which the philosophical views of Marx and Engels could be learnt. Plekhanov, FPM, page 3. Lenin repeated this evaluation in 25th anniversary of the death of Joseph Dietzgen. End footnote. Karl Kautsky conceded that Capital was an altogether more powerful book, but added that, quote, only owing to Anti-Düring did we learn to read and understand Capital the right way, end quote. Kautsky. That's from Aus der Frühzeit des Marxismus. End footnote. As Engels himself observed, Anti-Düring provided the most detailed account of historical materialism. It has remained ever since one of the most authoritative. Footnote. Engels' letter to J. Bloch on the 21st of September, 1890. Few people, if any, who are interested in the views of Marx and Engels would disagree with Bertrand Russell's opinion that the clearest statements of the materialist conception of history are to be found in Anti-Düring. The passage of time has confirmed these impressions and views about Anti-Düring. As his biographer, Gustav Meyer, observed, what Engels considered as a thankless task turned out to be, quote, the decisive blow for the conversion of continental social democracy to Marxism, end quote. Wikipedia says Gustav Meyer, who lived from 1871 to 1948, was a German journalist and historian with a particular focus on the labor movement. He fled Nazi Germany in 1933 and lived the final years of his life in England. Back to the text. In Anti-Düring, the original views of Marx and Engels were revealed for the first time in simple and lucid language to a whole generation of social democratic leaders, writers, and thinkers, to men like Bebel, Bernstein, and Kautsky in Germany, Plekhanov and P.B. Axelrod in Russia, Victor Adler in Austria, Labriola and Turati in Italy. I don't know who Turati is. Wikipedia says Filippo Turati, who lived from 1857 to 1932, is an Italian sociologist, criminologist, poet, and socialist politician. Back to the text. Only upon the publication of Anti-Düring, quote, were a real Marxian school and a real Marxian tradition created on the continent of Europe, end quote. That's from Gustav Mahler, Friedrich Engels, and David Ryazanov and Friedrich Engels, by David Ryazanov's Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. End footnote. Furthermore, at the suggestion of Paul Lafargue, Marx's son-in-law, Engels extracted 3 chapters, the most relevant and free from polemics, from Anti-Düring, which Lafargue translated into French and published in Le Revue Socialiste and under separate cover in 1880. The pamphlet, known in its English version under the title Socialism Utopian and Scientific, caused to Engels' delight a, quote, real revolution in the heads of the French, end quote. Footnote. Engels' letter to Edward Bernstein on the 8th of August 1882. See Edward Bernstein, Die Briefe von Friedrich Engels on Edward Bernstein. The German version had the title Die Entwicklung des Sozialismus von der Utopie zur Wissenschaft. It might be also Utopia, I'm not sure. Zur Wissenschaft, and was first published in 1883 with the year 1882 on the cover page. It was preceded by a Polish translation which appeared in Geneva the same year as the French. The English translation was first published in 1892. End footnote. It was translated during its author's lifetime into 10 languages and became as famous and widely read as the Communist Manifesto. While the circumstances to which Anti-Düring owes its existence have long been forgotten, the book has not lost its significance many years after its publication, but continues to be read and, rightly or wrongly, is a recognized source of knowledge of Marxian theories. Section 2. The prevailing view on the intellectual partnership of Marx and Engels. Dialectical materialism as formulated in Anti-Düring has been traditionally regarded as the common product and property of Marx and Engels. Footnote, see Lenin and Zambart. 2 different pieces, but a piece by Lenin and a piece by Zambart. The piece by Zambart being titled Der proletarische Sozialismus. End footnote. Some contemporary writers go even further and attribute dialectical materialism to Marx exclusively. According to G.A. Vetter, Marx may, quote, be considered as the founder of dialectical materialism, end quote. Sorry, I was saying if there's anything for J. Vetter, and I can't find any. According to J. Vetter, Marx may, quote, be considered as the founder of dialectical materialism, end quote. Footnote. Vetter changed his view entirely in Die Umkehrung Hegels. In the opinion of, end footnote, in the opinion of Henri Lefebvre, the extension of Les Dialectiques concrètes à la nature was accomplished by Marx and only followed by Engels under Marx's close supervision and approval. Footnote, Henri Lefebvre, Le Materialisme Dialectique. End footnote. While eschewing this extreme point of view, others firmly dismissed as groundless the idea that Marx and Engels could differ in their views concerning the problems of the philosophy of nature. See D. Jurovsky, Soviet Marxism and Natural Science. End footnote. The only justification of the traditional belief that Anti-Düring represents not only Engels but also Marx's Naturphilosophie comes from Engels himself. Quote, I must note in passing that inasmuch as the mode of outlook expounded in this book was founded and developed in far greater measure by Marx, and only in an insignificant degree by myself, it was understood between us that this exposition of mine should not be issued without his knowledge. I read the whole manuscript to him before it was printed, and the 10th chapter of the part of economics, from the critical history, was written by Marx, ... And as a matter of fact, we had always been accustomed to helping each other out in special subjects, end quote. Engels. It is easy to understand why Engels' account has been accepted uncritically by practically everybody. Engels' statement in Anti-Düring merely brought out, with explicit reference to a particular issue, what people have always felt to have been the case in general, namely, that the views of Marx and Engels were without exception absolutely the same. Franz Mehring emphasized the identity of thought and intellectual development of Marx and Engels, and Gustav Meyer followed in his footsteps. Gustav Meyer being the, as we just learned, the biographer of Engels. Heinrich Kanov, or Kanau, I guess it's Kanov. I've seen this name before, and I think I might have even read something by him before, but I'm not sure who this guy is. It says that Heinrich Kanov, born April 1862, died 1936, was a German Social Democratic Party politician and prominent Marxist theoretician. Heinrich Kanov was confident that Engels wrote nothing without the approval of Marx, who was even in the habit of seeing the proof sheets of what Engels was about to publish. Footnote: Heinrich Kanau, Die Marxische Geschichts-, Gesellschafts- und Staatstheorie. End footnote. M. Bauber, an American scholar, wrote that, quote, the two friends thought and worked together, and it would be impossible to dissever the thoughts of one from those of the other, even if the task were possible. It is doubtful whether it would yield fruitful results, end quote. M. Bauber. Or Bober. It's probably Bober, actually. That is in reference to a Mandel Morton Bober, who wrote a book, evidently, Marx's Interpretation of History. End footnote. Or, not footnote, back to the text. Even if the task were possible, it is doubtful whether it would yield fruitful results, end quote. Bober. Both friends and foes, and among the former, persons as different as Karl Kautsky, Plekhanov, Lenin, Karl Vorländer, or Sir Isaiah Berlin, are in full agreement, as Kautsky put it, quote, the totality of Marx and Engels' literary production constitutes a spiritual union, eine geistige Einheit, end quote. Kautsky, aus der Frühzeit des Marxismus. End footnote. According to Vorländer, from 1845, Engels' philosophical development was interlinked in every respect with that of Marx, and they could no longer be differentiated. Footnote. This qualification is important for such of Engels' publications as Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy from 1844 and The Condition of the Working Class in England 1845 make it clear that Engels was at first ahead of Marx. It was Engels, says Gustav Meyer, who opened Marx's eyes to the facts of economic life. End footnote. Marx's philosophical views may be inferred from those of Engels, and what Engels said about his friend's contribution and assistance behind the scenes is inherently reliable. This must also have been the belief of Lenin, who in his essay Karl Marx drew almost exclusively upon the works of Engels to outline Marx's conception of materialism and dialectics. R.N. Carew Hunt describes Anti-Düring in Lenin's manner as, quote, the best general exposition, end quote, of Marx's philosophical views, and Sir Isaiah Berlin went even further, for he claimed that Engels, quote, understood his friends' new, only half-articulated ideas sometimes better than he understood them himself, end quote. Isaiah Berlin. I want to see who this R.N. Carew Hunt person is. He wrote a book called The Theory and Practice of Communism, an Introduction. And that's all I'm seeing when I Google him. It is clear from this wide range of opinions that according to the common implicitly or explicitly accepted assumptions, one cannot and should not differentiate the views of Marx from those of Engels, for those views were perfectly identical. The two friends were intellectually twin brothers whose achievements constituted living unity. There is no reason to dispute the fact that during Marx's lifetime, Engels, with his knack for writing quickly and clearly and with his talent for popular exposition, often interpreted Marx's main doctrines. It is right to emphasize that frequently it was owing to Engels that others first came to understand how Marx viewed the course of history and what inferences he drew from his interpretations. After Marx's death, the authority of Engels, Marx's lifelong friend and editor of his manuscripts, increased enormously. Engels' likable character, his admirable modesty and humanity, his unswerving loyalty to Marx, his intellectual honesty and common sense, implicitly induced trust and confidence in his testimony. He considered himself and was recognized by others as the faithful and rightful guardian of Marx's original thought. This does not necessarily provide the guarantee that Marx's thought is to be found authentically in Engels' writings. The fact that Engels was the recognized interpreter of Marx's system, and that he was also a writer in his own right, prompts the re-examination of the whole question concerning Engels' intellectual relationship to Marx. Section 3. Engels' tradition in the interpretation of Marx. It was Sidney Hook who in the early 30s challenged the accepted opinion that from the beginning of their personal, intellectual, and literary friendship, the views of Marx and Engels were identical. Considering the indisputable fact that they were minds of a different order, the alleged identity of views is highly implausible. In a letter to J.P. Becker, Engels frankly confessed that, quote, in Marx's lifetime I played second fiddle. Don't see anything when I Google J.P. Becker. But there's a footnote. It's just a citation. Engels wrote to Franz Mehring with his unfailing and also self-revealing modesty that Marx was a man with a, quote, more rapid coup d'oeil and wider vision, end quote, than himself. If after Marx's death he was given more credit than he deserved, quote, history will set all this right in the end, end quote. Engels felt sure that, quote, what Marx accomplished I would not have achieved. Marx stood higher, saw further, and took a wider and quicker view than all the rest of us. Marx was a genius. We others were at best talented, end quote, Engels. Engels never tired of emphasizing that it was owing to Marx alone that, quote, socialism became a science, end quote. Marx made the two great discoveries. Namely, he revealed the secrets of capitalist production in his theory of surplus value and formulated the materialist conception of history. Although the second of these discoveries was attributed to both Marx and Engels, Engels claimed for himself, quote, only a very insignificant share, end quote, and publicly and consistently discounted any suggestion to the contrary. The greater part of its leading basic principles in the realm of economics and history and their final trenchant formulations belonged to Marx. He limited his own share of their elaboration and application. Similarly, the condition of the working class in England represented only one phase of the embryonic evolution of modern socialism, which was, quote, since, bracket then, end bracket, fully developed as a science chiefly and mostly, almost exclusively through the efforts of Marx, end quote. Notwithstanding Marx's appreciative references to the condition of the working class in England and of outlines of a critique of political economy, Engels held unflinchingly to the position that, quote, what I contributed, ... Marx could very well have done without me, end quote. Engels. Engels' self-effacement may have been exaggerated and was actually effective. And was actually excessive. That Engels was Marx's intellectual inferior is a fact, however, of which not only Engels himself was aware, but which was also recognized by others, including some of the greatest admirers of Engels. See, for instance, Lenin's Frederick Engels and Max Eastman's Marx and Lenin, and Gustav Mahler's Friedrich Engels. End footnote. On the other hand, there is no reason to believe that because Engels had neither the inventive genius nor the deep historical and social insight of Marx, they were divided by a gulf of important differences of opinion. On the whole, it is enough to assume, as Hooke did, that Engels gave a characteristic twist to the doctrine of Marx. The emphasis given by Engels to Marxian thought consists in viewing it as a monistic system concerned with the ultimate constituents and laws of the universe rather than as an application of a unified method. Thus, for instance, Engels gave final currency to the belief that Capital, the book, was an exposition of a system of political economy, not a critical sociological and historical analysis of a particular socioeconomic formation undertaken from the standpoint of the class-conscious proletariat of Western Europe and, above all, eine Streitschrift, as Edward Bernstein put it. In philosophy, a similar shift was accomplished for Marx, who after his break with Hegel was uninterested in academic metaphysics and the theory of knowledge, was presented by Engels as a supporter of dialectical materialism and naive realism. But Marx did not embrace Engels' modern materialism. Neither did Marx accept Engels' theory about sensations being images or copies of the objects of the external world. These doctrines are incompatible with the views to be found in Marx's works, with his, quote, naturalistic activism, end quote, and the conception of sensations as, quote, forms of practical sensory activity, end quote. If Engels had never published Anti-Düring, and this might easily have happened considering the circumstances of its publication, nobody would have regarded Marx as a dialectical materialist in Engels' sense. Marx's own works do not contain the basic assumptions of dialectical materialism and do not justify the application of this label to their author. As has been mentioned earlier, apart from Engels' account in the preface to the second edition of Anti-Düring, which was written and published after Marx's death, there is no other evidence that Marx dissociated, quote, history from, quote, nature, or differentiated between, quote, dialectical and, quote, historical materialism and regarded the former as logically prior to the latter. Marx did not disavow the responsibility for the views expounded by Engels, but he need not have seen any necessity for doing so. He might have felt that there was no danger of a work of Engels being construed as an exposition of his own philosophical beliefs. In the preface to the first edition of Anti-Düring, published in Marx's lifetime, Engels said that the criticism of Düring's philosophy gave him the opportunity to set forth, quote, my views on controversial issues which are today of a quite general scientific and practical interest, end quote. Engels. He suggested nowhere that what he wrote committed Marx in any way. Quite a different problem is the question as to what was Marx's opinion about Engels' peculiar combination of science and speculative philosophy, and the most plausible answer is that Marx did not trouble to make up his mind about it. At that time, Marx was entirely engrossed in his own work, above all in the completion of the remaining volumes of Capital, which increasingly prevented him from becoming interested in matters unrelated to his main task. In 1873, Marx's health began deteriorating seriously, and there was constant fear that he might suffer a stroke. Although Marx temporarily rallied his ebbing strength, thanks to an extended medical treatment, annual visits to the seaside and Carlsbad, a complete recovery was never achieved. Having completed the second edition of the first volume of Capital, 1872, and the editing of its French translation, 1875, he kept up his vast correspondence but wrote practically nothing apart from short articles. In 1878, that is, the year of the first publication of Anti-Düring, Marx suffered a relapse of bad health and was able to do no more work, even on Capital. The last revisions and additions incorporated in the second volume of Capital date from 1878. About the same time, the anxiety concerning his wife, who was suffering from cancer, began in earnest. Frau Marx died in December 1881, and, as Engels said, on the day of her death, quote, the Moor also died, end quote. 1 year later, January 1883, Marx suffered the second painful blow, the sudden death of his eldest daughter, Jenny Longuet. Jenny Caroline Marx Longuet lived from 1844 to 1883 and was the eldest daughter of Jenny von Westphalen and Marx and Karl Marx. Briefly a political journalist writing under the pen name J. Williams, Longuet taught language classes and had a family of 5 sons and a daughter before her death to cancer at the age of 38. Back to the text. There were, therefore, ample reasons why Marx should have showed little interest in what Engels was doing, especially since at first they both regarded a reply to Düring as a task too unimportant to be bothered about. There's really no need to explain why Marx allegedly acquiesced in the attribution of Engels' doctrine to him, for no such attribution was actually made during his lifetime. Marx is probably entirely unaware, and he had every right to be so, of the implications which were to be drawn from the anti-Düring with respect to his own philosophical beliefs. The fully developed division of the, quote, theory of Marxism into dialectical materialism, providing the most general assumptions and procedures, and historical materialism, based on dialectical materialism and applying its laws to the study of society and history, can be found only in Marxism-Leninism, that is, in Lenin's interpretation of the doctrine attributed by him to Marx and Engels. But many basic Leninist ideas are contained in their rudimentary form in anti-Düring or are based upon the views of Engels expounded in this work. In particular, contrary to the views of some exponents, Engels tried to deduce dialectics of society from dialectics of nature and to provide the communist world outlook with a Naturphilosophie. Footnote. See Gustav Meyer, Friedrich Engels. Meyer argued that communism had a cosmic and metaphysical meaning for Fourier, but not for Engels, who, accepting the possibility of a thermal death of the universe, was a cosmic pessimist. On this account, Engels was allegedly unwilling to speculate about the constitution of the universe, and to establish his historical and social theories on the foundations of a philosophy of nature. Where am I? In the preface to the second edition of Anti-Düring, Engels confessed that his work contained more than he originally intended to say. He realized, post factum, that in his examination and refutation of Düring's doctrine, his, quote, negative criticism became positive, end quote, and that, quote, the polemic was transformed into a more or less connected exposition of, the communist world outlook, end quote, Engels. The comprehensive system which, in his opinion, was the common property of Marx and himself, comprised the views presented to the world in The Poverty of Philosophy, the Communist Manifesto, and Capital, as well as some, quote, positive conceptions, end quote, developed alongside the polemic against the philosophy of Düring. The latter ranged over a vast area of subjects, both practical and scientific, and dealt, to use Engels' own words, quote, with everything under the sun and with some others as well, end quote. He frankly conceded he followed Düring into realms where at best he could only, quote, claim to be a dilettante, end quote, and had, quote, to exercise great caution, end quote. Engels is aware that he went further than he originally planned. He knew that he overreached himself and was uneasy about it, although later his self-criticism gave way to the pleasure which the success of Anti-Düring aroused in the author's breast. Notwithstanding Engels' original uneasiness, Anti-Düring became the main source of knowledge about, quote, the philosophy of Marx and Engels, end quote. Unintentionally and somewhat unknowingly, Engels established the tradition which ascribed to Marx a coherent monistic system of materialistic metaphysics in the accepted sense of this term, comprising a philosophy of nature, a theory of society, and a view of history, all three derived from a common set of first principles and logically supporting each other. Anti-Düring is the original and most important source of this tradition, and in particular of the false belief that the materialist conception of history is closely connected with or deducible from philosophical materialism. It was in this way that at the turn of the century, Anti-Düring was read by the first generation of students and followers of Marx, quote, as its name already shows, end quote, wrote Bernstein, quote, the materialistic conception of history closely hangs together with a materialist world outlook, end quote, Bernstein. The same view is voiced by Ludwig Voltmann, who claimed that, quote, historical materialism is only a special application of dialectical materialism to the history of mankind, for history itself should be conceived as a segment of the universal natural process, Naturprozess, end quote. Ludwig Voltmann. Wikipedia says that Ludwig Voltmann lived from 1871 to 1907 and was a German anthropologist, zoologist, and neo-Kantian. He studied medicine and philosophy and obtained doctorates in the two fields from the University of Freiburg in 1896. Ludwig Voltmann falls in the spiritual and ideological history of the 20th century with the racial theorists Arthur de Gobineau and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, in particular in terms of his racial theoretical thought. In his book, Die Germanen und die Renaissance in Italien, 1905, he argued that the emergence of the Renaissance in Italy was led not by the descendants of the Romans, but by the Germanic tribes who had subdued Italy during the Middle Ages. His ideas were mainly published by the journal Political Anthropological Review from 1902 to 1907, and in the book Political Anthropology, written in 1903. This and two other of his books were published in a 1936 Otto Reche anthology. Weird guy. Plekhanov conceded that the, quote, general public, end quote, often use the term, quote, Marxism to refer to historical materialism, but Plekhanov asserted that this was not correct and that historical materialism cannot be separated from, quote, philosophical materialism to be found, quote, fairly fully set forth, although in a polemical form, in the first part of Engels' book, Herrn Eugen Dürings Umwälzung der Wissenschaft. Plekhanov. It has rightly been said that the doctrine of Marxism, as understood by Plekhanov, came into being in the period separating the death of Marx from that of Engels. It has rightly been said that the doctrine of Marxism, as understood by Plekhanov, came into being in the period separating the death of Marx from that of Engels. That's been said by Georg Lichtheim in Marxism. Engels' philosophy was taken to be a faithful representation of Marx's original views and acquired the status of Marxian orthodoxy. Engels' interpretation of Marx, later codified by Lenin and Stalin into the canonical doctrine of so-called Marxism or Marxism-Leninism, was, however, subject to some important revisions. In the early 1920s, Georg Lukács maintained that when Engels extended Marxian dialectics outside the realm of history and society, he misunderstood Marx entirely. About the same time, Karl Kautsky argued that Marx's historical materialism did not need the support of philosophical materialism or even of the materialism expounded by Engels and Anti-Düring. Similarly, a few years later, Sidney Hook claimed that Marx did not conceive of dialectical materialism as a doctrine of nature, distinct from a theory of society and history, for the attempt to apply the dialectics to nature was incompatible with his basic position. Sidney Hook was supported by Bertrand Russell and more recently by a number of other scholars and historians. Footnote. See Russell, Freedom versus Organization, Herbert Marcuse, Reason and Revolution, J.Y. Calvez, La Pensée de Karl Marx, I think it's Lessig, Kolakowski, Karl Marx y Klasina, that's something in like Polish. L. Landgraber, Das Problem der Dialektik. Irving Fetcher, who's Marx and Marxism, is on this channel, or is in the process of being on this channel. Jean-Paul Sartre, Critique de la Récente Dialectique. R.C. Tucker, Philosophy and Myth, and Karl Marx and Georg Lichtheim, Marxism. End footnote. If the view of these writers is essentially correct and anti-Düring does not provide a substantially true account of Marx's philosophy, the question arises as to how Marx's philosophic position should be described. Section 4. The Naturalism of Marx and the Dialectical Materialism of Engels. Marx believed that man is an object of nature, that his mind or soul is not a supernatural entity, that there is an essential unity of mind and body, and that human behavior can be explained by means of empirical hypotheses to be tested by the procedure accepted in natural science. But these beliefs do not make Marx a dialectical materialist, nor even a materialist in the usual sense of the word, unless naturalism and materialism are considered identical. Naturalism is usually defined as the view which regards mind as part of nature and demands that it should be investigated by the same method as that applied to other parts of nature. This brief statement is not incorrect, but it does not do justice to all essential beliefs of naturalism, and might lead to the confusion of materialism and naturalism. Naturalism comprises a cosmological and methodological component. As a cosmological doctrine, footnote. For a more detailed discussion of the distinctive characteristics of naturalism, see R.W. Sellers, Realism, Naturalism, and Humanism, and in particular, I think it's Ernest Nagel, Logic Without Metaphysics. End footnote. As a cosmological doctrine, naturalism claims the self-sufficiency of nature, rejects the primacy of mind, accepts ontological pluralism, and emphasizes the basic significance of the categories of time, space, and causality for the knowledge of the world. As a methodological conception, naturalism asserts that we can have reliable knowledge only of such objects as can be investigated by scientific method. Scientific method is not identical with the procedure applied in physics or biology, but with certain accredited ways of standard procedures of acquiring knowledge, such as observation, experiment, and inference, and of which different sciences make use in different ways, determined by the subject matter and technical means available. As a rule, a naturalist combines the methodological conception of naturalism with some naturalistic cosmological principles which expose him to the object of being a concealed materialist. Which expose him to the objection of being a concealed materialist. Marx has constantly been described as a materialist, a name which he himself did not renounce and did not wish to disclaim, and contemporary naturalism is often criticized for disguising its true nature by using a misleading name. See C.J. Dukas, Nature, Mind, and Death, and M. Farber, Naturalism and Subjectivism. End footnote. The methodological premises of naturalism imply that human behavior can be adequately explained in terms of causal laws of the same sort as those which govern the conjunction and sequence of natural phenomena, without resorting to the teleological order of events to ideals, values, spirit, or normative standards. To accept the existence of only such objections as can be studied by scientific method does not necessarily imply metaphysical materialism. It is important to realize this distinction, though it was not clearly made and applied in the times of Marx. Marx himself used, quote, materialism and, quote, naturalism synonymously, perhaps because he defined materialism as the opposite of Hegelian spiritualism, that is, as a view which denies the independent existence of mind without matter. While materialism, in some sense of the term, may be a true doctrine, it can never be known to be true. On the one hand, while materialism may be false, it can never be disproved. Since naturalism is compatible with both the truth and the falsehood of materialism, naturalism cannot imply materialism and still less be identified with it, as some philosophers seem to believe. Naturalism is not a metaphysical but rather an epistemological and methodological doctrine. is a systematic reflection upon the procedures applied in the acquisition of knowledge about the world and not a system of beliefs concerning the ultimate constituents of the world. If the naturalism of Marx should be differentiated from the dialectical materialism of Engels, the problem arises to how the latter emerged from the former. The answer to this question, the problem has first to be extended. Naturalism is closely related to positivism and clearly opposed to metaphysics or speculative philosophy. To regard Marx as a naturalist philosopher seems to militate, therefore, against the accepted view of Marx being deeply affected by Hegel and sharply critical of Kant and positivism. On the other hand, dialectical materialism is hostile to positivism and favorably disposed to speculative philosophy. This particular combination of intellectual attitudes appears in turn to be incompatible with the view that Engels is the founder of dialectical materialism, for he is, or is widely considered to be, positivist rather than a positivist rather than a Hegelian. In order to disentangle this intricate cluster of conflicting influences and intellectual loyalties, the impact of Hegelianism and French positivism upon Marx and Engels has to be re-examined. There is much evidence that in their formative years both Marx and Engels were affected by these two schools of thought, which at that time were the major centers of philosophical attraction. While the examination of the relation of Marx and Engels to Hegelianism and positivism has an inherent interest of its own, it also affords an occasion for defining and explaining the important differences in their respective philosophical positions. It may also help toward an understanding of how dialectical materialism, a conception essentially alien to the philosophy of Marx, emerged from and replaced the naturalism of Marx. Historically, the incompatibility of naturalism and positivism on the one hand and Hegelianism on the other is not as unquestionable as it might appear. F.A. Hayek introduced the term, quote, Hegelian positivism to denote a trend among those thinkers, Ernest Renan and Hippolyte Taine in France, Marx and Engels in Germany, Benedetto Croce in Italy, John Dewey in the United States, which succeeded in combining the ideas derived from Hegel and Kant. Quote, Hegelian positivism, end quote, is an apt expression to designate Engels' dialectical materialism. As presented in Anti-Düring, dialectical materialism combines the elements of three different trends of thought, namely the naturalism of Marx, Hegelian philosophy, and French positivism. The contribution of each of these trends to the final outcome has to be examined before the historical development and logical analysis of dialectical materialism are undertaken. The end. Thanks for listening.